Okay, let us look at chapter 6, which is all about language. And I just wanted to call your attention to, if you remember, this was in chapter 7 that looked at the differences between verbal communication, i.e., chapter 6 language, and nonverbal communication, chapter 7. And just remember, this chart looks off. Just remember this, but because we're going to be looking at this. Generally, when we are using words, whether we are using our voice to speak the words or we are using our phone to send a message, or we're using sign language, it is for the most part voluntary. Nobody unconsciously types a letter. Okay, and usually, remember we talked about nonverbal would be how we express the relationship we have towards the subject or towards the person we're talking with. Usually the words have to do with the content, what exactly it is that we're trying to say. Language can be clear or it can be vague. It is primarily shaped by culture. I mean, we didn't talk about this much for nonverbal communication. It seems to be more rooted in biology, but it is also shaped by culture. Okay. Nonverbal communication is continuous. Remember, we talked about how you can't shut it off, whereas with language, we can. We can start and stop. And then with words, we have one channel, one way. It's the words only. Whereas with nonverbal, remember, we have tone of voice, we have distance, we have posture, we have gestures, we have everything, except you're not going to call it body language unless you want me to turn into the Hulk. Okay, so, okay. So, let's look. This chapter is divided into 4 sections. The first section has to do with the nature of language, and on the right-hand side, you see this is something that's called the Stroop effect. If I were to say to you, I want you to look at these and say the color. Don't say the word. So you do orange, blue, yellow. Oh, I'm not sure. Is that purple, black? It's a lot harder to say the color than it is to say the word. That to me, I find this really interesting. But okay, I'm going to gallop through these, and remember, if you have questions, bring them up in class for sure. Language is symbolic. This is one of the things I'm going to ask people to share things in a different language. And while the words seem right, like they use the example of the word 5. Like when we see that symbol, if you're a native English speaker and you think 5 and everything else just seems a little bit like, well, that's not really 5. We have to translate it. Language is rule governed. They talk about, So, they talk about some of the different rules, like the phonological rules, how words are pronounced. And then they talk about the syntactic rules, which is how the language is structured. And the semantic rules have to do with what words mean. And the pragmatic rules tell us how we would interpret the message in the various concepts. Our textbook covers this in roughly 1 page, both sides. These were 4 separate classes that I took. So obviously you're getting the very condensed version. Okay. The fact that language is subjective is that they say that the meaning is in people, not in words. We all look at a word, but it means something different to everybody. Like you might say the word family, and for some people that gives them a warm, fuzzy feeling, and for other people it makes them want to run away. So that's how it can be subjective. I would like to talk a little bit about language and worldview, and in fact, I hate when we're Elron, because there's a video that I want everyone to watch. And if I assign it, I find that about half the students watch it and half don't. But showing the video in class is also not terribly effective. But the idea that, okay, it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the idea that the words that we use help to shape the way that we see the world. And I would argue also the way that we see the world helps us with the words that we choose to use. Anyways, that's a concept that could really blow your mind, and I would really like to discuss it because that's one that I find very interesting, and that has to do a lot with culture. Okay, really quick, the nature of language. All right, so if we look at the impact of language, I'm going to ask people to talk about their name and whether they like their name, and if they're, what they think of when they hear specific names. Okay, so there's if I said to you, oh, hey, we have someone new who's joining the class and we realize it's a little bit late. Her name is Gertrude. You would probably picture someone who's like 80 years old because Gertrude has not been a popular name for a few decades, I would say. Gertrude or Pearl or Agnes. It might still be popular in Poland. I'm not sure. Okay. We can use language to show that we belong to a group. When we change our language to fit in with that group, that's called convergence. Or we can specifically choose to make our language different because we want to say that we're not really part of that group, and that's called divergence. Sometimes we do this consciously, and sometimes we do it unconsciously. I like to think if you've ever heard a parent or somebody from a different generation who's trying to use slang and you're like, no, that's not working. They're trying to converge, but it's, I guess, too phony. Okay. Older editions of the textbook talked about powerless speech and powerful speech. I don't know why they do speech in one part and language in the other part, but they would say that powerful speech, okay, this is for a low context culture such as the United States, Great Britain, a little bit Canada. Canada's too nice to really be using powerful language. It is direct. It is forceful. We use declarations and assertions. Okay? And then they say, well, what do we contrast that with? If it's not powerful, it must be powerless, meaning it's a little tentative. Rather than coming out and saying something directly, we're a little bit more indirect. We hedge. Well, I'm not sure, but we use hesitations. I'm not sure. We might use also disclaimers. I don't mean to be rude, but let me turn off my ringer. Okay. This is a very low context centric way of viewing the world. Because in a high context culture, being tentative and being indirect is not powerful. It is actually polite. So the textbook is, I don't know that they do a great job, but they acknowledge that in some contexts, that kind of language would be considered polite because it saves face for both the sender and the receiver. So we might be a little more evasive. We wouldn't be as direct, just because what's important in this when we're using this kind of language is harmony. Okay, so we can talk about this absolutely. If this is something you're interested in, bring it up. Okay. The impact of language still, I would say read the textbook. Are we using language that is sexist? Because not us, of course, but other people, are people using sexist language because they are unaware that it is sexist? Like people who say the chairman of a committee. Well, I at one point was, I was in charge of the humanities department, and I was called the chair. So that was gender fair language, because to call me a chairman was not accurate, and chairwoman, geez, I don't know, always makes me think of a woman wearing a hat and I don't know, doing the garden club or something. So sometimes people use sexist language because they do not know, and other times they use sexist language because they are, quite frankly, sexist. Oops, what the heck did I just do? Okay. And the same thing with racist language. I would also here like to talk a little bit more about microaggressions, because I know there were some questions and we kind of ran out of time to talk about them. So we could talk about racist language and the idea of microaggressions, which are kind of hidden racist language. Okay, I gotta go fast. Definitely in class, we will talk about one of the things which is my favorite, which is the abstraction ladder. If you have ever had gotten comments from me that said details are important, make sure that you use examples, explanations, specific, concrete details. You are at the wrong spot. You are at the top of the abstraction ladder and you should be lower down on the abstraction ladder. Okay. Then we could talk about euphemisms, relative language, evaluative language. These are times where we might intentionally choose to be a little more vague, or maybe we have misjudged our audience and we think that vagueness is a good thing. Okay, so here's a picture of the abstraction ladder, which I should probably have tattooed on me. Anyways, the language of responsibility is another thing. I definitely want to talk about it and but. And then we will spend some time talking about I, you, and we. The language of choice, it's avoiding words like have to, and instead saying things like choose. Remember when we did reevaluating your can'ts? Instead of saying I can't do this, we would say something like until now I've chosen not to, or I don't know how to. That is similar. It's moving away from these self-imposed, self-fulfilling prophecies in a negative way and making a more positive self-fulfilling prophecy. All right. And Joyce already said that one. Okay. And then the last one is what is the topic of our discussion. As I said in the other video, communication scholars, social scientists are in two camps. Sometimes one camp says men and women are significantly different in the way that they use language and the way that they behave socially. And so they are almost members of different cultures. So that's the major difference or significant difference. The minor difference is men's and women's speeches are actually more similar than they're dissimilar. And so this is where, there was a infamous book by John Gray called, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. That's the significant difference. And then there's a woman, Catherine, I forget her last name, Catherine something or other, who says instead we should look at the idea that maybe it's Catherine Dindia, who says maybe it's men are from North Dakota, women are from South Dakota, or even, I don't know, think of two Connecticut towns that are very closely connected. All right, and this is the topic of the discussion. All right, so think about what's what, anything you want me to talk more, that you would like us to talk about in more detail on Wednesday. Make sure you put that in the survey. In fact, if there are many things you want to talk about, you can just number them. 1, talk about but statements, and 2, talk about euphemisms, something like that. All right. I hope you enjoy chapter 6, and I'll tell you my life story when we get to class on Wednesday and how language changed my life.